The wedding night. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the faint hum of cicadas as the moon hung low in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the sprawling estate. The wedding had been a grand affair, a celebration of love and unity that had brought together the most influential families in the region. The bride, Mira, was radiant in her crimson lehenga, her eyes sparkling with joy as she exchanged vows with her groom, Arjun. The guests had marveled at the couple's undeniable chemistry, their love story the stuff of legends. But as the night wore on, an unsettling tension began to creep into the atmosphere, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the estate, a cavernous space adorned with intricate tapestries and flickering lanterns. The guests danced and laughed, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. Mira and Arjun moved through the crowd, their hands clasped tightly together, their smiles never wavering. But as the clock struck midnight, a sudden hush fell over the room. The music stopped, the laughter died, and all eyes turned to the large ornate clock that stood at the far end of the ballroom. Its hands had frozen at the stroke of 12, and a deep, resonant chime echoed through the room, sending a shiver down the spines of everyone present. Mira felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead as she glanced at Arjun, who seemed equally unnerved. The guests began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices low and anxious. It was then that Mira noticed the figure standing in the shadows near the clock. It was an old woman, her face obscured by a veil, her body draped in tattered black robes. She was holding something in her hands, something that glinted in the dim light. Mira's heart began to race as the woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The room fell silent once more as the woman raised her hand, revealing a small, intricately carved wooden box. Mira, the woman's voice was a raspy whisper, but it carried through the room like a thunderclap. You have been chosen. Mira's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, her grip on Arjun's hand tightening. Chosen for what? She managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. The old woman's lips curled into a sinister smile as she opened the box, revealing a small, ornate dagger. For the sacrifice, she said, her eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. The gods demand it. Before anyone could react, the woman lunged forward, the dagger flashing in the dim light. Mira screamed as the blade plunged into her chest, her body crumpling to the floor in a pool of crimson. The guests erupted into chaos, their screams echoing through the ballroom as they scrambled to escape. Arjun fell to his knees beside Mira, his hands trembling as he tried to stem the flow of blood. But it was too late. Mira's eyes fluttered closed, her last breath escaping her lips as the life drained from her body. The old woman stood over them, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of triumph. The sacrifice has been made, she intoned, her voice echoing through the room. The gods are pleased. And with that, she vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a room filled with terror and confusion. The guests fled the estate, their hearts pounding with fear, as Arjun cradled Mira's lifeless body in his arms, his tears falling onto her pale, lifeless face. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, something strange began to happen. Mira's body, which had been cold and lifeless just moments before, began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, and she took a deep, shuddering breath. Arjun's heart leapt with hope as he looked down at her, but his joy was short-lived. For when Mira's eyes met his, they were no longer the warm, loving eyes he had known. They were cold, empty, and filled with a darkness that sent a chill down his spine. "Mira," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. But Mira did not respond. Instead, she rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were being controlled by some unseen force. She turned to face Arjun, her lips curling into a sinister smile. "The sacrifice has been made," she said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "But the gods are not yet satisfied." And with that, she turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving Arjun alone in the silence, his heart pounding with terror. Part 2. The Awakening. The days that followed Mira's death were a blur of grief and confusion for Arjun. The estate, once filled with laughter and joy, was now a place of mourning. The guests who had fled that fateful night had spread the story far and wide, and soon the entire region was abuzz with rumors of the cursed wedding. Some said that Mira had been chosen by the gods as a sacrifice, while others whispered that she had been possessed by an evil spirit. But no one could explain why her body had disappeared from the estate, leaving behind only a pool of dried blood. Arjun was consumed by guilt and despair. He had failed to protect Meera, and now she was gone, her body vanished without a trace. He spent his days wandering the estate, searching for any sign of her, but all he found was silence and emptiness. The servants, too, had fled, leaving the estate to fall into disrepair. The once grand ballroom was now a shadow of its former self, the tapestries torn and the lanterns shattered. The only sound that could be heard was the faint rustling of the wind through the trees, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had taken place. But as the days turned into weeks, Arjun began to notice strange occurrences around the estate. Doors would slam shut on their own, and the sound of footsteps could be heard echoing through the halls, even though no one was there. At night, he would hear the faint sound of a woman's voice, whispering his name in the darkness. At first, he tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, a product of his grief and exhaustion. But as the occurrences grew more frequent and more intense, he could no longer deny that something was terribly wrong. One night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, he heard the sound of footsteps outside his door. His heart began to race as the footsteps grew closer, and then stopped just outside his room. He held his breath, his eyes fixed on the door, as the handle slowly began to turn. The door creaked open, and a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candle on his bedside table. In the darkness, he could just make out the silhouette of a figure standing in the doorway. "Meera," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. The figure stepped into the room, and as the moonlight streamed through the window, Arjun's heart nearly stopped. It was Meera, but she was not the Meera he had known. Her skin was pale and lifeless, her eyes cold and empty. She was wearing the same crimson lehenga she had worn on their wedding night, but it was now stained with blood. She moved towards him with an unnatural grace, her feet barely touching the ground. "Arjun," she said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "You left me." Arjun's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Meera, I didn't mean to. I tried to save you, but it was too late." Meera's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You failed me, Arjun. And now, you must pay the price." Before he could react, Meera lunged forward, her hands closing around his throat. Arjun struggled to break free, but her grip was like iron. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as the darkness closed in around him. Just as he was about to lose consciousness, Meera released him, and he fell to the floor, gasping for breath. "Remember, Arjun," she said, her voice cold and menacing. "The gods are not yet satisfied." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Arjun alone in the darkness, his heart pounding with terror. Part 3. The Curse. Arjun's life had become a living nightmare. Every night, Meera would return, her presence growing more malevolent with each visit. She would appear in his dreams, her cold, empty eyes staring into his soul, and when he woke, he would find her standing at the foot of his bed, her hands reaching out to him. He tried to flee the estate, but no matter how far he went, she would always find him. It was as if she were bound to him, a curse that he could not escape. Desperate for answers, Arjun sought out the old woman who had appeared at the wedding. He traveled to the nearby village, where he had heard rumors of a witch who lived in the forest. The villagers warned him to stay away, saying that the witch was dangerous and that those who sought her out never returned. But Arjun was beyond fear. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. The forest was dark and foreboding, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Arjun followed a narrow path that led deep into the woods, his heart pounding with every step. As he ventured further, the air grew colder, and the sound of the wind through the trees became a low, mournful wail. Finally, he came to a small clearing, where a dilapidated hut stood, its roof sagging and its walls covered in moss. Arjun approached the hut cautiously, his hand trembling as he knocked on the door. There was no answer, but the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of herbs and incense, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of strange, unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room sat the old woman, her eyes closed, her hands resting on a wooden table. "You have come seeking answers," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. Arjun's heart raced as he stepped into the hut. Yes, he said, his voice trembling. I need to know what happened to Mira. Why is she like this? The old woman opened her eyes, and Arjun was struck by the intensity of her gaze. Mira was chosen by the gods, she said. Her sacrifice was necessary to appease them. But the gods are not easily satisfied. They demand more. Arjun's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. What do you mean? What more do they want? The old woman's lips curled into a sinister smile. They want you, Arjun. You are the key to their satisfaction. You must complete the ritual, or the curse will never be lifted. Arjun's heart sank as he realized the truth. What do I have to do? The old woman reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. She opened it, revealing the same dagger that had been used to kill Mira. You must offer yourself as a sacrifice, she said. Only then will the gods be satisfied, and Mira's soul will be at peace. Arjun's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He had come seeking answers, but he had never imagined that the truth would be so horrifying. He looked down at the dagger, its blade glinting in the dim light, and felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Is there no other way? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old woman's eyes gleamed with a malevolent light. There is no other way, Arjun. The gods demand it. Arjun's hands trembled as he reached for the dagger, his mind racing with thoughts of Mira and the curse that bound them both. He knew that he had no choice. If he wanted to free Mira's soul and end the nightmare that had consumed his life, he would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. Part 4. The Ritual. Arjun returned to the estate, the dagger clutched tightly in his hand. The air was thick with tension as he made his way to the ballroom, where the ritual was to take place. The room was dark and silent, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the broken windows. Arjun's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped into the center of the room, the dagger gleaming in the moonlight. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of taking his own life filled him with terror. He thought of Mira, of the love they had shared, and the life they had planned together. He thought of the curse that had torn them apart, and the nightmare that had consumed his life. He knew that there was no other way. As he raised the dagger to his chest, he heard a faint whisper in the darkness. Arjun. His eyes snapped open, and he saw Mira standing before him, her eyes filled with tears. Don't do this, she said, her voice trembling. There has to be another way. Arjun's heart ached as he looked at her, his hand trembling as he held the dagger. Mira, I don't know what else to do. The old woman said that this is the only way to free your soul. Mira shook her head, her tears falling onto the floor. No, Arjun. There is another way. The old woman lied to you. She wants you to die so that she can take your soul and use it for her own dark purposes. Arjun's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. What are you saying? Mira stepped closer, her eyes pleading with him. The old woman is not a servant of the gods. She is a servant of the darkness. She used me as a pawn in her game, and now she wants to use you. But we can stop her, Arjun. Together. Arjun's heart swelled with hope as he looked at Mira, her eyes filled with determination. What do we have to do? Mira reached out and took his hand, her touch cold but comforting. We have to destroy the dagger. It is the source of her power. If we can destroy it, we can break the curse and free ourselves. Arjun nodded, his grip tightening on the dagger. Then let's do it. Together, they made their way to the old woman's hut, the dagger clutched tightly in Arjun's hand. The forest was dark and foreboding, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As they approached the hut, they could feel the malevolent energy emanating from within. The old woman was waiting for them, her eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. You have come, she said, her voice a raspy whisper. But you are too late. Arjun stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. We know the truth, he said, his voice trembling with anger. You lied to us. You used us for your own dark purposes. The old woman's lips curled into a sinister smile. And what will you do now, Arjun? You cannot defeat me. Arjun's grip tightened on the dagger as he stepped closer. We'll see about that. With a swift motion, he plunged the dagger into the wooden table, the blade sinking deep into the wood. The old woman's eyes widened in shock as the dagger began to glow with a bright, blinding light. The air was filled with a deafening roar as the light grew brighter and brighter, until it consumed the entire hut. When the light finally faded, Arjun and Mira found themselves standing in the clearing, the hut gone without a trace. The air was still and silent, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. Mira turned to Arjun, her eyes filled with tears. "It's over," she said, her voice trembling with relief. "The curse is broken." Arjun's heart swelled with joy as he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "We're free," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. But as they stood there, holding each other in the moonlight, they both knew that their journey was far from over. The old woman may have been defeated, but the darkness she had unleashed still lingered, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. Part 5. The Aftermath. The days that followed the destruction of the dagger were a time of healing and renewal for Arjun and Mira. The curse had been broken, but the scars it had left behind would take time to heal. They returned to the estate, determined to rebuild their lives and put the past behind them. The estate, once a place of darkness and despair, was now filled with light and hope. The servants returned, and the ballroom was restored to its former glory. The tapestries were repaired, and the lanterns were relit, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and music, a stark contrast to the silence and emptiness that had once consumed the estate. Arjun and Mira spent their days together, their love stronger than ever. They talked about the future, about the life they would build together, and the family they would one day have. But even as they looked forward to the future, they could not forget the past. The memory of the curse, and the darkness that had nearly torn them apart, was always there, lurking in the back of their minds. One night, as they sat together in the ballroom, Mira turned to Arjun, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We can't let the darkness win," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We have to make sure that no one else has to suffer like we did." Arjun nodded, his heart swelling with pride as he looked at her. "You're right," he said. "We have to protect others from the darkness. We have to make sure that the curse is never unleashed again." Together, they made a vow to protect the world from the darkness, to use their knowledge and experience to help others who might be facing similar horrors. They traveled to nearby villages, offering their help to those who had been touched by the darkness. They shared their story, warning others of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, and offering hope to those who had lost it. As the years passed, Arjun and Mira became known as protectors of the light, their names spoken with reverence and gratitude. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, their love and determination shining like a beacon in the night. But even as they worked to protect others, they never forgot the lessons they had learned. They knew that the darkness was always there, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. And they knew that they would have to remain.